that's coming off a win against Baylor at home in overtime, a team that beat them last year by 2 touchdowns, a Baylor team that's supposed to be generally as good as they were last year, that again pushed BYU around in the trenches last year, wasn't able to do it this year. BYU missing its 2 top wide receivers from last year. They go to overtime. BYU pulls it out. Your thoughts about what the Cougars present?
I think it's, I talked about the things that Oregon didn't do very well. I think the thing that's really interesting about this matchup is that the way I expect BYU to challenge Oregon are in ways neither of the first 2 opponents really did, which is why I think this is going to be kind of like we're going to learn a lot about areas we usually haven't seen Oregon challenge in this year. Even against Georgia, I won't say that Oregon was like dominating at the point of attack at line of scrimmage because that's just not factually accurate. But Oregon ran for like 150 yards in that game. I think it was the second most yardage rushed for against a Georgia defense in several seasons. I know Georgia has a lot coming back, but Oregon was able to kind of hang tough there in the trenches. And even Georgia, when they had the football, didn't really run right in the middle of Oregon's defense, which is Oregon's strength. And Eastern Washington wasn't able to do anything there. Well, I don't think BYU is going to shy away from trying to run the ball right up the gut. And they didn't do that against Baylor this last week, even though they didn't have a ton of yardage. I think they only had 85, 87 yards rushing or something like that on 30 carries. But they were pretty proactive in trying to establish the line of scrimmage. And I think they'll try to do that against this Oregon defense, which through 2 games, at least you feel like that's supposed to be where the strength of this defense is. I think we'll learn a lot about that. So I think that part's interesting. And then on the other side of the football, for Oregon, Oregon really hasn't been able to push the ball down the field this year in the passing game. A lot of it's been kind of underneath. I think they're going to try to take some shots at BYU because BYU's front 7 is really, really good. This is a defense that, you mentioned it a year ago. Baylor just kind of pushed them around up front. And then in this last game, Baylor only ran for like 150 yards on 50 carries. So, I think there's some optimism from BYU. And then BYU, by the way, did a great job limiting Baylor passing attack. I think they had 137 pass yards. I was just looking at it earlier today. So nothing really worked for Baylor. We'll see if Oregon can have some success throwing the ball down the field, I should say. Because Bo Nix, you talk about bad Bo Nix, but there's also the little bit of that gunslinger mentality too, where he can throw the ball around a little bit. He's not somebody who's devoid of being able to make the big throws. It's just he also throws in some passes that nobody feels like is the right decision. It's a little bit of that, like, it's probably not the exact right player comp, but a little like Jay Cutler back in the day, where it's like, oh man, here's just this incredible throw, and then here's 2 or 3 where you're going like, what are we doing? Why are we putting the ball over there? So I think it'll be interesting to see because Oregon does have the skill talent to stretch the field against BYU. And I would be curious to see if they can succeed there. So a lot of the elements to where I think both offenses figure to have success are areas where Oregon really hasn't either looked to go just because of matchup. Against Eastern Washington, they just basically played 2 high safety soft zones and gave Oregon 10 to 15-yard passes every down. And Oregon went and picked up 40 first downs, a school record, had 600 yards, scored 70 points. From what I've seen of BYU, they're going to be their approach. They're going to play some man. They're going to be more aggressive. So I'm really curious to see exactly how Oregon, if they can have some success throwing the ball down the field. So I think that's what makes this game interesting to me, is that some of the areas where Oregon really hasn't really needed to or hasn't really had much success going in, I think are areas where they could have some success against a BYU team that is ultra talented and going to be a really big challenge. So I'm really curious by this one. I think this is going to be a really interesting matchup.
I was going to go with the poor man's Brett Favre.
Okay. Yeah.
We could go that route. Yeah. Jay Cutler. Absolutely. I'm sure. I would think that Bo Nix is actually faster, quicker than Brett Favre ever was, but he certainly doesn't have that like all-time NFL great arm strength. But there's an apt comparison there, and it gets him into trouble because he escapes and he's able to cross the field like Fran Tarkington like 4 times over and not get caught. But then, he runs up against Georgia and he can't make the same decisions, no doubt.